Today it's a real honor to have with me a wonderful musician, Maestro Miguel Harth-Bedoya. It's a real pleasure to have you with me to ask you some questions. So thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Um, I have many questions to ask you, but I'd like to ask with a simple one about your education, your beginnings with music, your path to becoming such an inspirational conductor and such a role model for so many of us and for so many Latinos around the world.
Well, my path was very simple in a certain way, at least to know where the horizon was. How to get there, I had no idea. But I come from a musical family, but not from the music that I do now, neither orchestral nor either classical or traditional or universal or contemporary, none of it. I grew up in a household where Latin American folk or pop music and music from Spain also existed. My mom is a freelance musician still, so she had ensembles, choirs, and my sister plays the guitar. So I grew up singing, playing. I was assigned the piano, later the violin. So live music was for me, the sort of the activity at home. But mind you, I had a normal life. I finished school and I played soccer every day of my life across the street, in the neighborhood, every single day. So there's no question. I really didn't invest any time in anything. So it was really in my last 2 years of high school that I got a job in the theater in Lima, and the municipal theater in the old downtown. So this theater, was back then over 100 years old, in a horseshoe shape, European style theater, like a very, very small version of the Teatro Colón type thing,
Wow.
produced operas. But I was working as backstage crew. So I was really never connected to the music directly, but from behind the scenes. So little by little, I was sort of ascended to other things because I could read music. So I could read the scores and I could help with the lights, with the curtains, with cueing, with moving people, with preparing people. And mind you, this is in the 80s where everything was manual. Everything was manual. There was no technology whatsoever, not even cameras for backstage, nothing. So you had to make tubes to be able to watch through it. You would sneak on tubes, most of them made out of toilet paper rolls, because the PVC wasn't really the thing. So anyway, but the impact of music and language and acting and singing and an orchestra, that's what really got my attention into becoming a conductor. Also, maybe because I had no talent to do anything else well. So anyway, as soon as I finished high school, I that's what I wanted to do. And the biggest problem is that we didn't have a school of music in Peru, so in the whole country, that I could train for this. So in searching, and to make the story short, I ended up finding the Curtis Institute of Music, and I got there when I was 19 years old. And my teacher then, Otto Werner Müller, was very kind enough to accept me as a student and really taught me everything from scratch. I had spent a year preparing for that exam with a few composer teachers like Enrique Turriega, who lived after past 100 years of age, and Carlos Boto. So they prepared me to learn music, not to conduct. No, nobody really trained me to conduct, because conducting is not about doing anything else than learning music first. If it doesn't come in, it doesn't come out. So that was very clear to me from the beginning. So once I got through my training at Curtis, then I continued further at Juilliard. Now that I've created the undergrad studies in conducting, I tell people I cannot imagine when people study 2 years. I mean, what can you possibly study in 2 years' time? I mean, content-wise. So anyway, that I did 2 degrees in conducting plus Tanglewood and this. So the first change in the path was this series of events. Having an audition at Curtis, that was life-changing, because until then I lived in South America, and I grew up in that context musically. I never heard a Brahms symphony. I never heard a Mahler symphony in my life, ever. So this was so foreign, so unknown. And then after I graduated from Juilliard, the first 2 jobs I got at the same time. Fortunately, one was as one of the assistants of the New York Philharmonic under Kurt Masur, who had just started, and also music director of the New York Youth Symphony at Carnegie Hall. So those 2 things gave me further learning because I spent 4 years as assistant at the New York Philharmonic, mainly observing and assisting, which Mazur was very clear, and you probably know from him directly, that you have to learn by watching and by seeing things that cannot be taught in a classroom or a book. So after those 4 years, of which I consider my training in looking back, so now I've been trained for nearly 10 years. So then I had my first music directorship, succeeded in marrying Alsop in Eugene, Oregon, and shortly after in Auckland, New Zealand. And yeah, so that's how it started. Back then, without the internet, without videos, without anything, really people knew about your work from people that had to work with you. So it was a slower process in a certain way. And that was the path.
Wow. And I know you've also been with the LA Philharmonic assistant and associate conductor with Esa-Pekka Salonen. And you've transformed. I mean, I'm going to ask you later on about your job as music director with the Fort Worth Symphony, with the Auckland Philharmonia, with the Norwegian Radio Orchestra. You have many accolades under your belt. But we'll get there in a second. Before then, I'd like to ask you, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that you've been ahead of the times in terms of, nowadays there is a lot more awareness about the importance of promoting new music, the importance of diversity in programming, but you've really been a champion of new music from the beginning. You've been at the forefront of the profession, and your collaborations with composers such as Jimmy Lopez and Esteban Pensecri have been really ahead of the times. I know you've also founded the Caminos del Inca project in Peru. So tell me a little bit about how this happened. Why is it so important to foster new music and diversity?
In my personal experience, literally on my first day at Curtis, I met Osvaldo Golijov, who was doing his doctorate studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And I also met Jennifer Higdon, who had graduated from Curtis and was there as well. So the first and most important collaboration for any musician is the composer. So if you don't collaborate with a composer, then you're missing a lot that goes beyond the printed music. So I've premiered works of Osvaldo Golijov that don't exist in the catalogs anymore, that he has taken them away. And also works of Jennifer Higdon. So we have been friends. So if we look back and we discuss diversity, well, that's the story of my life, not personally, but with every composer that I've met, because life in a providential way has put me in this path of getting to know people. Now, you also have to be open to meet people and meet composers and wanting to do that. And besides, at an earlier stage, as a conductor, you are more valuable to living composers than to dead composers, because everybody else is taking care of the dead composers. So that's just also how this was said from the very, very beginning. It was just part of what I did all the time. I never had to think, I'm going to do music from living composers. So it was ingrained in my upbringing, maybe because the path, that took me through this. And Jimmy Lopez, for instance, is an example. I met Jimmy when he was still in high school. He was 15 years old. Wow. I'm 10 years older than Jimmy. And so he wanted to be a composer. So he showed me a couple of his sketches and his things. And well, I said, go and talk to Iturriaga, who was the same composer that trained me to make it to Curtis, basically. And so he did, and he managed to go to the Sibelius Academy. So I've seen his growth from literally the very beginning. And when you get to know an artist through those stages, the wealth of, I wasn't going to say just information, but the wealth of a relationship, a musical relationship, goes beyond I can ever imagine. Now, that's the only case so far that I know somebody that has gone from, being a child basically to who he is now. And then other composers, you mentioned Esteban Pensecri. Now that's a different path. For instance, that was referred by a friend of mine, by Jesus Castrobalbi, who had played a piece of his called Rhapsody Andina for cello and piano. He said, so which means I'm always open to my colleagues telling me, you should look into this. Oh, I've come across this. Or sometimes me reading what they're playing. And many a times I don't even look at orchestral works only. I look at chamber music. Victor Agudelo from Colombia is another example. The first thing I encountered him was through a choral piece, an a cappella, SATV, piece called Ensalada de Verduras.
Wow.
When I look at this, things like that trigger my attention. So I've gone from those paths to my last project with the Norwegian, no, not my last project, but the next project with the Norwegian Radio Orchestra, which comes out this month through Naxos, is an album project of living composers with works from the 21st century only, from places that we normally don't associate the concert hall with. So it took me a long time to create this goal, and I only knew, I think, one or two of the 9 composers that I selected.
Wow.
Because I wanted to do that to myself. Can I find what I don't know through colleagues or through readings or through, now, I have to say, with the tools of the internet nowadays, in comparison to 25 years ago, which I was doing the same process, it's a little easier. But also the fact that there's so much information at the same time makes it harder to know where the right turns you have to take to get to what you want to. So this particular album has music from Egypt, for instance, by Nala Matar, or from Agerim Seilova from Kazakhstan, from Chris Gendel in New Zealand, from, who thinks of the Canadians? We forget about Canada, so Chris Stafilakis from there, so Harry Stafilakis, sorry, and so it goes, Uruguay, Chile, South Africa. So there's a wealth of music. It's just, as I said, it's part of my system, and I couldn't do without it.
Wow, I look forward to finding this album and listening.
It's called Journeys.
Journeys, wow. And I guess, yeah, absolutely right, that accessibility nowadays makes it both easier and more difficult. You have such a wealth of information available, and yet then you have to filter through a lot more. So I wanted to ask you next, you've been the leader, the music director, principal conductor of several orchestras, including a very long tenure at Fort Worth, and I think you've revolutionized that orchestra, and you've made it well known across the country, really. I wanted to ask you about some of the differences possibly in working as a music director, principal conductor in Norway, in New Zealand, with several orchestras in the US. What are some of the lessons you've learned in this path?
The biggest lesson is the impact that music has on people, and it never ceases to amaze me. And right now that we are really deprived from direct music, just live music, I think we're going to see a stronger comeback, because that particular level of communication or connecting with people, it's the most powerful I've ever encountered. So in all my music directorships, I've never felt anything different. So that's only to say, can you maximize that? So we are at the service of a community, a group of people, an audience, whatever you want to call it, through what we do. So it's a twofold. I have to maintain the excellency of my group with goals, so that in turn, the people that we connect with are better served for quality or for variety, you name it. That's a whole different thing of programming and how do you attend to that. Now, also knowing how long your tenure will be is important, because you have to pace how you're going to communicate this information. Is it the repertoire or your guest artist or who knows, all kinds of things. So those thoughts have been across all my positions in artistic leadership. That doesn't change. What changes is the actual environment you're in, the city you're in, the country you're in, the mentality, what's the word? The customs of people, long short concerts, outdoor concerts, that type of thing. So we have to also adapt to what exists, but always challenge in the good way, because there's See, there's so much music. None of us humans will be able to hear or do the entire musical canon. It's just humanly impossible. But that's the beauty of it. There's always something that can impact people. Now, mind you, concert hall is a little bit like a restaurant. There are people that like to eat the same thing in the same places because that's a specialty. Fine. And there's the times that you go to the same place, but you're going to take the chef's recommendation because then you trust the cooking and not necessarily know what's going to be presented to you. So I like to add that to the flow as well. Now, if you know you're going to be there only for 3 years or 4 years, then you plan differently than if you're going to be there for 10 years. I never thought I was going to be principal conductor and music director for 20 years. You know, we started with 4 years and 4 years. Then we said, okay, let's do 10. And then our centennial came in my 12th year. So and then said, let's just wrap it up. And we were always wrapping it up. You know, I was always just closing the last 3 years. The last next 4 years was my planning. But then you realize then this only ends when you stop thinking, when you stop coming up with ideas and projects, because some of those projects take 2-3 years to realize, you know, including when we went to the Kennedy Center for the Shift Festival, that took years of planning. Or when you do recordings, and you know, and we managed to do recordings for Harmonia Mundi, for Naxos, which in the US for an orchestra that you would say it's a regional orchestra, it's nearly impossible to do. But more importantly, I was satisfied that the quality of the orchestra was being represented through these recordings, most of them through, you know, first recordings or through collaborations with artists that was part of it. And I was very proud that the comments and the exposure that we got through those, such as in Gramophone magazine or the BBC magazine, were favorable, because not just doing a recording is good enough, but that somebody else that doesn't know your music making think favorably of your contribution, both in the repertoire and in the playing of it.
Well, what an accomplishment. Had the orchestra done any recordings before your time, any releases on labels?
That I don't know if were on labels. They were in-house made, a few of them. But I also have to tell you that until I came to Fort Worth, the idea of having a living composer was no,
Wow.
Simply. And you should know that Joaquin Rodrigo wrote his last concerto, which is Concierto para una Fiesta, which was his, I believe, second last piece that he ever composed, was written for the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra. Wow. The symphony commissioned that piece to Joaquin Rodrigo.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and it was a huge success in 83, I believe. So then it's so successful, then they thought we're going to commission another piece to this other composer. And apparently that experience didn't go well at all. It went probably the most opposite way. Then they said, okay, we're done with this. So I inherited that past of having gone to something very successful to absolutely the opposite. So I made it personal. I said, I'm going to start with all my friends, and they're going to come here, and you're going to meet the people that are responsible for the music making. And so who were my friends way back in 2000? The young ones upcoming, Osvaldo Golejov, Jennifer Higdon, then Gabriela Frank, then Jimmy Lopez. Nobody had heard of them, even around. I mean, this is still, you know, maybe Osvaldo and Jennifer, but Kevin Putz and so on and so forth, completely unknown. And look, the relationship that we have had and the orchestra, and looking back, the legacy of living composers that have come through the concert hall and met audiences, because to me, that was the condition. If we're doing a piece by a living composer, the composer has to be around, has to be. Otherwise, we're losing, you know, a great percentage of the impact that a living composer brings to the experience.
Wow. I'd like to ask you about your relationship to Peru and its music. And I know you also helped establish the Philharmonica de Lima.
De Lima.
So you're still very active in the music scene in Peru.
Yes and no. It's good to leave. In other words, there are cycles of leadership. And I don't think anyone personally should stay forever. Even when you leave, you are there. I don't think it's healthy, because also you are not allowing others to take leadership roles. So this is when I've left orchestras, I really leave. And it's not, if I have guest conducted as a return conductor, totally fine. So I maintain now, but this is since 2000. That's when I finished my directorship there. Yes, I go every year, and I've alternated between the National Symphony, the very school youth orchestras. Absolutely. I took Midori once a few years ago, and she spent a whole week, and she taught and she rehearsed. So which ensemble do you do this with? And you can. So basically I told everybody, why don't you all get together and let's just do and experience that, the joinings, forces, right? So yes, I've maintained my relationship from that point of view. For instance, I did the inaugural concert of the Gran Teatro Nacional. Finally we have a performance venue. Wow. Lima didn't have one for decades, actually the whole country. So, and I'm also very interested in being able to help as a bridge to the outside, to other countries, other continents, to my peer fellows, or now that I'm old, I can help with knowledge rather than with connections. And that's why in this new stage of my life, devoting myself to training young conductors and musicians, it requires dedication and time. You can't just do it in your spare time because you are not really doing this in a thorough way. So that's the extent of my current relationship with Peru. I want to do, for instance, projects in Cusco and in the adjacent areas through what we call the Peruvian Baroque music, which hasn't happened much, but there's a wealth of, for instance, combining tourism with music of a particular place in the particular places where things happen and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done. And in addition to the work I do with musicologists and musicologists of the music that was not written, which is fascinating and equally valuable than music that is written down.
Wow. I will ask you afterwards about your current also role shaping the future of music as an educator. But before we get there, I'd like to ask you, you've worked as a guest conductor all over the world, also with some of the main orchestras like the Chicago Symphony. What are some important considerations to take into account when you arrive as a guest conductor to an orchestra for the first time, especially?
Well, I think the first thing is that the orchestras want to know that you know what you're doing at your best at that point. I don't think anybody expects any conductor to be perfect, and much less if you are in your 20s, in your 30s, even in your 40s, because it's just not possible. Nobody's perfect, and music shouldn't be perfect. Music should be musical. So, but that you are at your best prepared, because conductors really work in preparing before that first rehearsal. And that to me has been the pivot point. That first, I call it the first encounter, because it's not really just a rehearsal. And it can be the first recurrent, because if you're a regular guest conductor, it's actually harder to maintain standards because orchestras measure you from your last time. If you conduct an orchestra only once, there's no way to compare you with anything because you weren't there before to do that. So to me, it's just that, be as prepared with the music that you are doing, and hoping that the music you are doing is really something that you love, and you don't have to be thinking about what you're doing, why you're doing this music. So it goes a little bit along those lines. It's not that tangible of an answer, but nothing that we do as conductor is tangible. Right. So if I want to say, be clear, be clear about what, so that the what is more important than the how you do it.
This is so important what you just said about not, the experience not being tangible. And so I want to follow up with, somewhat related question about rehearsal techniques, and if there is anything you tried that you find that worked very well or didn't work. And it can vary by situation, of course.
Oh, of course, there are many things that don't work because a rehearsal scenario is completely unknown. A performance is a little more predictable because you are preparing to do that. In a rehearsal, you don't prepare to do a rehearsal. So, to me, the most valuable tool is awareness as things are happening in the rehearsal, and remember what just happened as you're busy doing what is happening and getting ready for what's about to come. So it's a three It's not three dimension. It's three layers of time that we have to be working on, and that's invisible to people. People have no idea that that's going through our mind, because the moment we stop, now this is the key. This is something factual. The moment you stop, you should know why you're stopping and what to say. The worst is, as an advice, when you stop in a rehearsal, everybody's waiting for something to be said or instructions to be given or something. And when the conductor doesn't know what to do, is looking through the scores and what do I do next, this is just not a good sign of your senses were not connected. Now, there are moments in which something like that has happened at the level of, I've reached the point, I remember I don't have a solution and I know it. Well, the best thing is to say, take a break or I'll see you tomorrow, so that you step out of the podium and then you continue working on how to do the next thing. But you will never know what you will do because nobody has played anything that comes your way. You can only do that after something has happened. What if it's perfect? Then you don't have to fix it. So it's hard to know if there's a conducting technique. I like to think more, it's a concept of the process that it's changing every single time, because you may repeat the passage and now it sounds different, and sometimes you keep repeating it and it gets worse, so you just don't know.
Wow. Are there certain areas of the repertoire that you haven't gone very far yet that you'd like to do, or more of this, more of opera or ballet or anything that you'd like to explore more of?
There's a lot that I haven't done, and sometimes for various reasons. Sometimes it's a matter of scheduling. For instance, the operas, I've been doing only one every 4 years or so, because it takes a lot of time commitment. And we still have 2 children at home, that are finishing now their schooling. So it's a little bit part of that. I like to invest the time in the family. Otherwise, why do you have a family and are not around? So when the time comes, and if it comes, great. Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to have done some wonderful productions of Santa Fe Opera or English National Opera, great Bohème with Jonathan Miller, Canadian Opera Company, and so on and so forth. So I feel very blessed. I've done a few dance productions, but in terms of the actual repertoire, for instance, the one I'm venturing now, finally, is Baroque music, because they don't need much of a conductor to start with. But I'll be performing at the Oregon Bach Festival, a couple of two parts of the Christmas oratory. It was supposed to be the St. Matthew Passion, it got changed, but I'm working with the Baroque orchestra.
Wow.
So, and I've taken the time to sort of get trained and not just read about it, but work with colleagues that are in that field and, learn, because it's fascinating when there's room to open up learning and sonorities at our age. But that was exactly the same thing I did when I worked with Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road projects. When you're going to be working with instruments that, a Comanche, a Sheng, a pipa, it's exactly the same thing, in the sense you have to learn about the mechanics or the musical options or anything that has been written for those instruments. So that's something that I'm very much looking forward to. Of course, I had 2 Passions canceled this year, both St. John and St. Matthew, last year now. And there's the second Viennese school that I'm working very hard at trying to understand it. And I've done a few works. So again, the question should be asked, are you good enough to do that or that? For instance, I haven't spent a lot of time conducting the music of Shostakovich. I've studied the music of Shostakovich over and over and over. And I still go back, and before I make the decision, I think I should do this. Maybe I shouldn't do this piece. So to me, studying the music or conducting the music the conducting is really a consequence of, have you invested in loving something fully? Then you should conduct it. Otherwise, can you imagine, I'm not conducting my favorite music. If you tell that to the audience, I'm just doing this because I was asked to do, that would be a terrible, thing. So I like not to put myself, in that situation.
Wow, that's a great answer. Now, I want to ask you about your role mentoring young musicians. After 30 years of working professionally all over the world, you're also now a professor. You also have a summer conducting institute. So tell us a little bit about how this fits within your schedule.
Yes, and I'm in the process of writing a book.
Wow.
Yes, another book, but a different book. So it is the first time in my life that since 91, so nearly 30 years, that I'm not a chief conductor somewhere. Now, I've started conducting before 91. And I cannot tell you that it's good or bad. It's just different. But I planned this about 2 years ago. And so my actual podium activity at the moment is as a guest conductor. I was recently with the Houston Symphony last month. And I was fortunate enough to have conducted in New Zealand and Spain and Sweden throughout the pandemic with live audiences.
Wow.
And so my next concerts in Japan next month have been canceled because the country is shut down completely. So hopefully they'll be rescheduled, in the future. But so I'll maintain my activities as guest conductor, but then I don't have to think beyond choosing a program, delivering it, and leaving. So my focus right now is through the new position that I've started at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, a wonderful school of music, fairly new as a school of music, under a decade old. It was a department before. So I'm the Director of Orchestral Studies, so I take care of anything that is ensemble related, so orchestra, chamber orchestra, and so on and so forth. But I was very interested in having a space where I can train orchestral conductors from the undergraduate level so that they can spend, at least 4 years, sometimes 3 if you have transferred, before you can get a master, so that you can master on something that you know, which was the concept of becoming a master. Then the Conducting Institute, I founded as a platform, which, by the way, we're announcing it next week in person. We just did a trial in person without any issues, COVID related. The Conducting Institute is a platform in what I call a safe environment, safe musical environment, for beginners, for people that either want to know, that have never had that entry step. Where do I start? There's a lot of where do I start. But I also work with people that want to focus or revise the foundation. So that's what I enjoy, helping people to solidify their tools of learning, because a conductor does that. I self-teach myself alone. So I work with music teachers and music educators, youth orchestra conductors, civic orchestra conductors, anybody, because it's the same principles and the same training. Like swimming, you can only talk so much about swimming, but if you don't put your feet in water, you'll never know what it feels. But at the same time, stepping into a swimming pool with a little bit of water and not the right amount of water, that's also not good. So, but in conducting, a high percentage is understanding what conducting is and the music, and really a small percentage is executing it. People think that I had enormous amount of podium time throughout my training, because I hear that, oh, how much podium time does your class have? How much? And I'm thinking, why are they so interested in how much podium time? The concern should be how much quality podium time is there rather than quantity. So for the record, my conducting time allowance was about 20 minutes a week throughout my entire training.
Wow.
So it proves that really you don't practice with an orchestra. You should never practice with an orchestra, because what do you do later in the future? What you practice during rehearsals, that's just not going to get you too far. So I think it's the right balance.
It goes back to what you mentioned earlier about chord mazur, where there was a lot of observing to be done and learning things that you can only learn through that.
Absolutely. And then you just apply, because that's the difficulty of the conductor, is what do you do at best in the limited time? Everything is limited time for a conductor, because you are bound to the time schedule of somebody else, not yours. The only time that you have at your disposal is the preparation, and you can start years in advance if you want.
So I'm looking at the clock here. I know we have only a few minutes left, but I have 1 or 2 questions depending on how long we have. What is, in your opinion, the role of music nowadays? And is there anything you would change in the format, the structure, the business side of things?
Well, the role of music, it's unite people. I think that's not going to change because of, I know it sounds like a cliche, but the power of music is unique. Most of music without words doesn't have to be explained because music can do that. Now, as in the format, I don't like to use the word change, but throughout, let's say, the past 200 years, give or take, they were in concerts like we know now. Concerts didn't exist. So that became a thing. Now there are concerts. Now things got adapted. Now there's an intermission. I want to know when intermissions were invented. And I have a feeling that the gift shop and the bars have something to do with it. Right. When did printed program books come up because of advertising? I'm not talking about program notes, because that you can trace back to some composers, including Berlioz, that said, I want this to be part of the experience. But, you know, printing this, doing this. So I'm sure we'll keep evolving. I have no doubt about. But what is not going to change, and should, to me, not change because it'll be a great loss, is the life experience. Because that's the one that you cannot pause, you cannot stop, you cannot change applications and move to something else. You are really connected to what's happening at that very moment. This reminds me when I love going to live sport events. And in my youth, and I saw Peru, Argentina play those soccer matches, and Peru, Brazil, in Brazil, which is very scary not to be a local there. you wouldn't dare to blink because there's no replay.
Right.
If you miss the shot, you missed it. So in a live setting, there's that. You can't go back to what you missed in the sense of being wholesome with the music. So I hope that never changes. Now, there may be new platforms. You know, we're certainly seeing more streaming, broadcasting, and all of that. But remember, we're so used to recordings now, as in solid, you know, items such as LPs, CDs, cassette reels, and so on and so forth. At one point, when recording started, there were two sides. Oh, great! We can export this. We can move this along. And then the other side was, this is terrible because people are not going to come to concerts. But it's one or the other. I mean, it's just an option. So I don't have a solution really, but I'm sure we'll keep evolving. Like, what do we wear? You know, attires, uniforms. Oh, it better be evolving. Absolutely. Otherwise, we'll be left behind.
Wow. So I have a final question for closing, which is any advice that you would give to young musicians, anything maybe related even to the pandemic and the difficulties young people might be experiencing?
It's the same advice I give myself every day. Why you do what you do. And that has to be very, very clear. If your vocation is your profession, great. And if the why is the music, not the job or the goal, you have to know that. My why is the music. And I've always let music take me places for the purpose of music. I never thought, would I end up in Eugene, Oregon, in Auckland, New Zealand, Fort Worth, Texas, Omaha, Nebraska? Why not? I mean, the world is big. As long as your why is what holds you, that's the best I can tell you. Even in the pandemic, or even if you get sick and you're ill, I mean, it could be absolutely anything. Make sure that you know why you're doing what you're doing. So, and if you want to mention, I mean, I'm very accessible. You know, my website, you can find my information. Even Instagram, you know, I can check messages through Instagram. So I like that. I like to be available to be able to help others rather than just give advice and, you know, good luck with it type thing.
You've been so very generous with your time. I want to thank you for joining me and the wonderful answers you've given. So thank you very, very much. And I look forward to finding your journeys recording as well.
Thank you, Christian. Best luck.